just by way of introduction, last week we had a visiting priest here who gave the link, but for the 2 weeks before that, Father Michael was talking about how God reveals himself to us. How do we learn about God? The various ways of God's revelation. He talked about Holy Tradition and the Scriptures and the place of those in the church. And he also talked about how the final and ultimate revelation, so to speak, the final and the best way that God reveals himself, the ultimate revealing of God, is ultimately when God became man, right? The incarnation of Jesus Christ. That is the ultimate revelation of God in the incarnation. So, and I think Abuna also addressed a couple of weeks ago some of the challenges that we face as Christians, that every Christian has faced in having a real authentic experience of our Orthodox Christian faith in our own particular time, place, and culture. And so what we want to talk about today is that aspect of things. Like how does the Orthodox faith become incarnate, just as Christ became incarnate in the world? How does our Orthodox Christian faith kind of become incarnate in our own time, place, and culture? So how do we find Christ in the culture, so to speak? So just to get us started with that, one of the beautiful incarnation. One of the important distinctions we want to make, one of the foundational ideas to talk about this idea, is the difference between general and specific. So I want to ask you all a question. Someone tell me what your favorite food is. This is a really hard question, apparently. No, I thought...
Steak.
Steak? Steak? Okay. Now, is it just generally that you love steak, or do you like a particular cut of steak?
T-bone.
T-bone. Okay, T-bone. Is there a particular restaurant that you would say, like, that is the epitome? Like, or a time you've had it?
It's so long since I've been there, but yeah, Ruth Chris.
Ruth Chris. Okay. Perfect. So this is kind of what we're talking about. Thank you, Will. Perfect example. So Will doesn't just love steak. That's not his favorite. I mean, he loves steak. It's his favorite food. But what he really loves is something more specific than that. The love that he has for that he has a memory of that T-bone at Ruth's Chris, right? He really loves that very specific thing. And when it comes to the way we experience the world through the specific, not through the general very much. Like it's easy to say, actually, I love mankind, I love people, right? It gets harder to love people when we're talking about a specific person with their foibles and their, quirks and the things that might annoy us about them, things about that nature, right? We experience the world in specifics. We're not just human beings. We are human beings, but we're not just that. We are human beings living in North America in the 21st century. That is a better way to think about how we experience the world. And the reason that we're talking about this is that just as we experience the world and relationships in specific ways, we also experience God in the specific, not in the general, right? So to kind of flesh this out, tell me which of these statements is more accurate.
Well, they're both accurate.
The second, okay, I heard the second one.
They're both accurate.
Both accurate. Idea, Nona?
I think the first one is more accurate.
You think the first one? Okay, good. So we have the first and second, the both. Okay. So I would say that just with almost every question where they give you an either or, the answer is both. That's my feeling, because we know that the incarnation that we just celebrated, like the Feast of the Nativity, it's all about the incarnation, right? God did become man, and that is an incredibly important theologically, existentially, ontologically significant event, meaning that it makes a huge difference to the universe that God became man. It is part of our salvation. It's hugely important. It's cosmic, in a sense. But besides the bigger picture of God becoming man, he also became a man, right? He became a man in a specific time, place, and culture. Jesus lived at one specific time, right? So this is why we can make icons of Jesus. because he was actually a specific person. He had a face, he had an appearance, he was a specific person. So besides becoming man, he also really existed as a specific person. So, stick with me as we're going with this. Do you believe that given that Jesus lived at a specific time, place, and culture, if he had lived theoretically, if he had lived at a different time, place, and culture, there's things that we read about in the Gospels that would be slightly different. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Right? Because as we're reading the Gospels, Jesus is interacting with his specific time, place, and culture. He uses food that they had available to them, right? Bread, loaves, and fish to feed the 5,000, right? That food was there. He interacted with the political and social leaders of his own time, right? The Romans, the Pharisees, and he argued with all of them. He healed the diseases and conditions that he saw in his society that were there in front of him, right? He healed lepers. He went to the poor and the tax collectors and the adulterers, people who were really in that society, in that culture, they were looked down upon, right? If Jesus came today, so to speak, and he wanted to do the same thing, he might go someplace different. I mean, we still have some negativity towards tax collectors in some way, maybe, but they weren't as negatively thought about as the tax collectors at that time, so to speak. So we're just making the case that Jesus existed even though he had this big picture, eternal impact becoming man, he also became a man in a specific culture, time, and place. And his ministry was shaped by that. What we read about Christ, that was shaped by that specific stuff. So what we're talking about today is that we as a church, as Christ's hands and feet now in the world, just as Christ existed in a specific time and place and his ministry reflected that, Orthodox Christians living in our time, place, and culture, we're supposed to do the same thing. We don't take a generalized cookie-cutter approach. Our Orthodox faith becomes incarnate in our culture, just as Christ became incarnate in his culture, in the culture of that time, so to speak. Does that make sense? Okay, awesome. So let's give a kind of a specific example of this. And I don't know whether you talked about this 2 weeks ago, so someone let me know if you did. But one of the best examples of this way that our Orthodox faith becomes incarnate in a culture is the example of when we pray in the liturgy, one of the litanies about the waters, right? We have a liturgy of the waters. Did you talk about this 2 weeks ago? No, okay. So I don't know if folks remember, but even when I became Orthodox in 2014, I think it was, all of the churches were still praying, in that part where we pray for the waters, they would pray for the rising or flooding of the Nile River. That was, in Egypt, that was part of the wording of that part of the litanies. Does anyone else remember that? We would always pray for the flooding. Okay, it's not just me. So, why did we pray for that?
Because that was what brought life to the area.
Okay, excellent. Yes, the life, in Egypt, the agriculture, the whole life depended on a series of flooding and rising, the seasonal cycles of the Nile River. All of the agriculture depended on that. People's life literally depended on that. And that was very pertinent to their day-to-day life. So they, supplicated God to ask that he would be merciful and provide them with what they needed to sustain their life. Now, it's fair to say, well, let me pose it as a question. Our sister church, right, the Armenian Orthodox Church, do you think that they now or ever have prayed for the Nile River?
No.
No. Why?
Because
It's not pertinent to their life.
Because they don't need it.
Okay, yes.
Second thing is when you pray for the thing that touches you the most.
Well said. So their lives are not affected by the Nile River. So it didn't really affect them. Now, so the practice that has become part of North American Coptic Orthodox Christianity, most of the bishops have gotten together and almost universally, instead of praying for the Nile River, we pray for the waters of the rivers. Because we have many rivers here. We don't depend solely on one river. We pray for the fullness of the waters of the rivers because we also depend on those for life, right? If you've lived in New Jersey long enough or California, you know that drought is a real possibility. It really happens from time to time. And so our life does depend, whether we think about it all the time or not. We also, our sustenance depends on God's mercy in keeping these bodies of water full. So culturally, that is the meaningful connection for us to keep our rivers and lakes full. Now, we had a chance, we've gone, I guess, 2 years in a row now to support a group of our Coptic Orthodox brothers and sisters in Bermuda. Interestingly, in that section of the Liturgy of the Waters, interesting fact about Bermuda, there's no natural sources of water on the island of Bermuda. They depend completely on rain for all of their water. So all of the houses have things collect water. Everybody's got a big tank of water. There's no rivers and lakes in Bermuda, except that are supported by maybe a lake or a pond supported by rainfall. But so they pray for the clouds, right? It makes sense to pray for the clouds and the rain. Their sustenance, their life depends on that. So this is just kind of one example a tiny example of how the faith is becoming incarnate in the different times, places, and cultures that it exists, right? It's becoming incarnate in the life of Bermudians, for whom, they depend on the clouds. You see where we're going with this. So, again, this is just one tiny example of changing one prayer around to really reflect the reality of the people who are praying it. So there's many other examples we can come up with, and I hope when we get to the end we can brainstorm to think of more examples. So if anything clicks in your head, think about it. Examples of how our faith can increasingly become incarnate in our culture, time, and place. Because the overall question is, what does an authentically American spirituality look like for Coptic Orthodox Christians living in North America, living in America at this time, place, right? What does a real, genuine spiritual life look like for us here? And I think my feeling about this, and we've talked and thought a lot about it. Sorry, these were other graphics that I totally forgot about. I feel like we're in a growing pains kind of stage in this process of figuring out what an authentically American spirituality looks like for us. And what I mean by that is we are going through the process bit by bit of kind of figuring out what that looks like. And the church is facing a lot of challenges in our space right now, right? We're spanning countries, we're spanning generations, we're spanning languages, we're spanning cultures. All kinds of complex things are at play in the Coptic Orthodox community in America, let's say, right? We have very recent immigrants, we have people who are the great-grandchildren of immigrants, right? And we have the challenge of needing to serve all of those people in a genuine way and make sure that they all have access to a spiritual life. So I call this growing pains because this process can be a little painful at times. There can be tension, right? There can be hurt feelings. I have a 9-month-old son at home. He has been teething, and teething is a good example of this, right? It's a teething baby is very grumpy. They're in pain. They're crying. They can be sick. They don't sleep. But these pains are the signs of growth, right? I would rather go through the pain and discomfort of that process and have teeth in the end, right? It's a pain, it's part of the process, but in the end, it results in growth. It results in something beautiful or wonderful or useful in the case of teeth, so to speak, right? So that's kind of how I feel like that's my contention. That's where we're at as a community here in North America. And so I want to take a little bit of time to talk about, as we're in this growing pains phase, what are some important things to keep in mind, principles or ways of thinking to kind of guide this process so we can be thoughtful about it. Firstly, the first principle is that we grow according to Holy Orthodox tradition. Like, this is a non-negotiable. Because some of us, especially in the Coptic community, we hear growing pains and we instantly think about change, right? And one of the beautiful and sometimes frustrating parts about Coptic culture is that change can be very scary, right? It's a good thing because that is how the faith has been preserved for so long, because being cautious about change is a good thing, not just blindly accepting things, right? Being cautious about change is good. But being totally anti anything that smacks of change can also be destructive. Because we're not talking about changing us being the core of our holy Orthodox tradition as Coptic Orthodox Christians, right? Let's see, what's an example? If someone, is anyone here immigrated from one country to another? Okay. Are you literally a different person? I know you've changed since you've immigrated, but are you the same? You're still Lizette, right? Yeah. Okay. You're still the same person. You've changed, you've grown, but you're still at heart, you're the same person. And when we're talking about the church growing and adapting to be authentically in American culture, we're talking about the same thing. The church in its heart is not going to change. Like the heart of Orthodox Christianity, the non-negotiables can never change. We're not going to change, we're not changing the creed. We are not changing what we believe. We're changing how we express that faith and how we engage with it. And this is not a new idea, guys. This is something that has happened in every Orthodox culture whenever it has happened. When St. Mark brought Christianity to Egypt, it became incarnate in the culture of Egypt. There's many examples. There's many examples that you could give about how parts of Egyptian culture and heritage became sanctified by Christianity. Christians started using these parts of the culture to even, teach about Christ, to point to Christ. They became holy things. One of the examples that instantly comes to mind is that in the early Roman Empire, very early Christianity, there were Christians who, since they were being persecuted so heavily, they weren't able to make, and they were often very poor, they had little resources. They used pictures of Greek and Roman gods as icons. They used those pagan things, and they sanctified them to become icons for them. They modified them, so perhaps a guard or someone wouldn't be savvy to the fact that this was, really a piece of Christian liturgical item or a Christian icon. So they sanctified it. Do you see what I'm saying? So again, this process of this growing pains, it's not changing the heart of who we are. It doesn't mean we are compromising the faith, and it doesn't mean when we're talking about changing or becoming authentically adapted, becoming incarnate, it certainly does not mean doing whatever feels good to us or whatever we're comfortable with, right? If we were using that standard, I think we'd all probably be a lot more comfortable with well, I don't give specific examples, but I mean, we'd all be more comfortable with like a 20-minute liturgy, right? Wouldn't that be more comfortable for most people, right? But we're not changing that. We're not talking about doing that. Our guideline is, first and foremost, what is the holy Orthodox tradition of the church, which Abuna has talked about in the previous kind of 2 sessions before last week. How do we get all of this revelation from God, the whole body of Christian holy tradition that we find in the church? That kind of stuff is not changing. And Abuna talked about the differences between kind of big T tradition and little t tradition, right? Like the things that are the cultural traditions with a small t, the way we express the faith, versus the holy tradition, the things that are non-negotiable, these holy Orthodox traditions that we don't vary from. We have a specific standard of faith. And what that specific standard of faith is, one way to think about it, or one way to kind of encapsulate it, is this quote from St. Vincent of Lerins from 434 AD, which says, "Hold fast that faith which has been believed everywhere, always, and by all." So in other words, when the faith has become incarnate in a place, there's been some things that have been adapted to make that faith authentic in that culture, to really adapt in that sense. But there are things that no matter where you go in Orthodox history, these things have always been believed everywhere by everyone who's Orthodox. There's consensus in the Christian world, right? That's the Holy Orthodox tradition that we don't vary from and that we always keep in place. So going back to the Nile example or the Liturgy of the Waters, with this example, we identify that the reason that this prayer exists is that people are praying to God. They're recognizing that their sustenance, their life, depends on God's grace and mercy. That is the fundamental assumption of the prayer, right? Like, because no matter what they're praying for, if it's the clouds in Bermuda, the Nile in Egypt, the rivers and lakes here, we are all praying, the core, the thing that is believed everywhere by all of us, is that we rely on God for our life. That God is in control of the world, He's in control of nature, He's in control of everything, and that we must supplicate Him, we must ask Him for His mercy and His grace to continue sustaining us. You see the common thread through all of those? So it's the same core belief, the same faith, expressed differently in 3 different places. So I think that's a useful example of that. So again, as we're going through this growing pains process, as we're trying to figure out this authentic American spirituality for Coptic Orthodox Church in North America at this time, this is a key principle that we cannot vary from. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. Second principle is that as we grow into this faith and we're in this growing pains phase, we have to use wisdom and discernment. As we talked about earlier, we don't blindly just accept things, and we don't blindly reject things. We take a considered approach and compare everything to the Holy Orthodox tradition. Is this thing that's being discussed, is this matter, whatever it is, that's kind of part of the tension or part of this growing pains, is it compatible with Orthodox Christianity as it has always existed? Is it compatible with Jesus Christ? That's always what we go back to. So again, no blindly either way. We don't blindly just say, we're not changing anything from all of our Egyptian cultural traditions. We don't blindly say, we're throwing out all of those things. They're worthless. Both of those extremes are bad and damaging. We have to be more discerning than that. And I think it's worthwhile to talk about wisdom and discernment. And I think I want to differentiate between the idea of discernment and the idea of judgment, or like being judgmental. Right? Discerning is using wisdom to figure out what to do, not just condemning. Judgment has a much more, condemning sort of tone to it. Judgment has no love to it, whereas discernment takes into account, discernment is steeped in love. As you're trying to make a difficult decision or figure out a way forward, discernment means we do it always in love. And discernment involves calmness and moderation. Whereas judgment can be harsh, it can be sudden, it can be extreme. Discernment, judgment looks like change is evil, or, we need to change everything, like we talked about. So, that's, I think, an important approach. And I think discernment also, in this matter that we're talking about now, discernment and wisdom also say that for this matter, there's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all approach, right? The way that we do things here at St. Anianus, we have never, I've certainly never heard anyone from our community say to other people from different communities that maybe do things slightly differently, that they need to do it how we're doing it, right? We never, that's an arrogant kind of judgmental approach, that to say that the way that we're doing it is the only way, and it's the best way, that it is the only way, and trying to force that approach on other people, right? We have, as we talked about, there's a complex factors involved in this situation we're in, right? And I think there's room for different approaches so that every single person can be served, right? Just because a church exists like St. Anianus that is trying to be incarnate in the culture that we find ourselves in, and that really our focus in trying to serve that population of people for whom that's an important piece, doesn't mean that in a community where there's tons of immigrant families, that their needs don't need to be served as well. I mean, they need to be served as well. They're just as valuable. We're not talking about any kind of value judgment here, right? There's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all approach, and I think a more discerning, wise approach to this whole matter would see that, rather than an extremist position on either side. Now, the last principle we talked about. What were the 3 principles? We grow according to Holy Orthodox tradition. That was principle number 1. I remember. I know it very well. I was just testing you. The second one was that we use discernment. We use wisdom and discernment in this process. And the third one is that we grow inside and outside the church walls. So the temptation in this process would be to think that making our faith incarnate or adapted or authentic in our time, place, and culture, it would be nice to think that all we would have to do is just switch around some words in the liturgy to make it more appropriate, or just do things differently inside our walls. But our Christian faith, being incarnate in a culture, means going outside the walls to really make that faith really being the hands and feet of Christ in the world. Because like Christ, as we talked about, like Christ addressing the needs and diseases of his time and place, right? He served the lepers, right? There's not much of a need for us to serve lepers in our society, but what are the needs and the diseases and the hurting people, and what are the needs of our culture? Who are the equivalent of those people, the outcast people, right? We still certainly have the poor who Christ cared about, but who are all the equivalent people in our culture that our faith is to be authentically in our culture? Who are we being called to go outside the walls and serve as well? As we make the changes inside, that authentic spirituality has to have legs. It has to have hands and feet that move us authentically to exist outside the church, outside the walls, authentically as well. Because otherwise we're kind of just a feedback loop. We're changing our words around so we feel better about it and we're more comfortable, but we're not really making that faith incarnate outside of the walls. So one story I like just to emphasize that is there's one verse I've just been fixating on recently when Christ is feeding the 5,000, and especially I think it's in the account in Mark, and the disciples come to him and they say, listen, there's this problem. All these people are here, they're hungry, it's getting late, and they want Jesus to send the people away to go, get something to eat or whatever. And Jesus says, anybody remember what Jesus says to them? You give them something to eat.
Yeah.
Right? Jesus doesn't say, yes, send them away so they can get stuff. He says, you give them something to eat. And I think we can take that as a instruction to us as well, thinking about how to be incarnate in the culture. What are the needs that we see in the culture around us, and how can we, as the hands and feet of Christ, incarnate in the world, in our time and place, what can we do to be the ones that give those people in need something to eat? Now, there's certainly other principles that we could talk about. It's it's obviously a very complex matter, but I think we'll hold it right there so we can have a little bit of time to discuss. Just in closing, I want to say on an encouraging note, I think really that these growing pains that we experience, if there's ever any tension, if there's ever any hurt feelings or misconceptions, I think those are part of the process. We're all struggling imperfectly to do this, to create this authentic American spirituality for our church. But I think we need to be patient and realize that, number one, this process that is begun in our time or is continuing in our time may not be finished by the end of our time, right? This is an ongoing process. It always is. As people change, as culture change, this is an ongoing process. And I think we should be optimistic about the way that this is headed. I think we should be very optimistic. I have a lot of hope. The church has existed in many places, times, and cultures throughout its history, and it's still alive and kicking, and has been creating, saving people. It has been producing saints for 2,000 years. So I think we can see ourselves as part of that process, not fret too much about it, not worry too much about it, but just accept the challenge and live, pray that God leads us through it as by His grace, that He provides us the wisdom and guidance that we need to act according to His will in this growing pains season. Glory be to God forever. Amen. So, I mean, I have some questions, but if before I put up the questions, if there's any general thoughts that folks wanted to contribute, with specific things coming to mind. Yeah, no?
I think as a practice, because I have 3 kids and I've been in America for 30 years almost, and as my kids, as an example of this generation that born in America and still keep the Coptic Orthodox belief to pass it through, not to pass it from generation to generation in a word, as a real belief. I practice with them is not to ever change it. I agree with you 100%. Also, do it with love and do it with them as a role model for them. Like when I sit with my son Mark, he loves the Coptic hymns, for example. I sit with him in the class. Yes, I have the time, but I was patient. And he was very good example to learn. Even when he studies his homework, he was doing the Coptic hymns. So I will say, with patient, like growing pain, it becomes a good result. When I look at it now, and I see my son is a deacon, serving God, in his generation, in America, with all the peer pressure that exists in America, and all the problem we know, is a very good example. So I agree 100% with the same thing. Growing pain, it goes with patience and love and consistency and being a role model for your generation in different example, it will give a good result in the end.
That's beautiful. Beautiful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I was going to say, like, coming from a mixed background, right? Like, my father's Jewish and my mother's Christian. Like, I think that what the Coptic Church is struggling with is something that Jewish people have struggled with too, because they have always been in diaspora. They've been people who have been persecuted, right, throughout their history, and yet have managed to like adapt to whatever, place that and time that they're in. So I think like looking to that, you can find kind of, how do you struggle with that? Because like when you're persecuted and if you're just very like closed, you preserve, right? When you're not under persecution, then people intermarry, and then you lose, you have the jeopardy of losing, right? Like that it becomes diluted to the point where you lose it. So that tension is interesting. I'm a product of it, and I'm also a part of it with my own kids. And so I just think that like recognizing it as like kind of a natural process and not something that's just unique to like Coptic people, that other people struggle with this and find answers to it and find that kind of balance is,
Yeah, definitely. We're not unique in that. This is definitely like, I'm the grandchildren of Dutch immigrants. I have very little connection to the Dutch culture anymore, but you could see it through the years. Like my dad, growing up in that Protestant community, he wasn't even allowed to play with Roman Catholic kids, right? There's like, you see it in the generations, different people are changing, they're struggling with protecting that identity, what that looks like, it's a dilemma for all these communities.
My grandmother didn't even know that my parents got married, my Jewish grandmother. Like my father couldn't even tell her. She died not even knowing she had a granddaughter. She died not even knowing that my dad was married. And in my generation, I have friends whose parents like got, thrown out of their family because they didn't marry someone who was Italian. Even they were still even both Catholic, but one was Italian and one was not. Was like Irish Catholic, and it's like, oh my God. So.
Excellent. Thank you. No, very, very good.
Discussion about prejudices on that.
Very good point. Yeah. Yeah. Sally?
I feel like it's interesting to look at like ritual and how that relates to culture as well, because I feel like ritual is like putting meaning to something that like is relevant to like the world around you. So like a lot of rituals that like started like the church, a lot of people in this present day don't really like have any attachment to that ritual. Some people can feel more spiritually aligned with God, like, you know, saying a little prayer on a mountain, because we are in North America and there's a lot of different different kinds of rituals that like activate connection to God and activate like kind of proof of his abundance. So I think that rituals are something that I think about often with like preserving culture in the church. If like people aren't making the connections to like why this ritual honors a certain kind of like abundance that God is like providing to us, then we're not going to practice it. A ritual has to be practiced. A ritual is something you like practice because it's like nourishing a certain like thing in your life, whether it's like creating routine, activating your spirituality, making your like relationships operate like in a healthy way. So I think about like keeping like religious preservation also like requires passing down what like ritual and tradition means, because sometimes it's not always like in alignment with the spirituality, but it's in alignment with like the religious value.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with what you said at the end, that with our rituals, it's really important to explain them, not that have them become empty rituals. And that's what your mom was talking about with exemplifying the practices of the church and what they mean, and have them be real in people's own lives. Yeah, because empty rituals die out for sure. But and I'm not sure you were saying this, but if the one cautious note that comes up when you say that is sometimes people just kind of blatantly write off ritual as being a negative thing, whereas
I think it's
I mean, but a lot of people will do that because, again, it's easier, it's more comfortable to live without rituals that people don't understand. We surely do.
We all do, whether you're like religious or not. I think like a lot of people write off religion because of rituals without realizing that they're creating their own culture and they're creating their own rituals for their livelihood.
Yeah.
But we're creating rituals that are attached to like a livelihood that's outside of just like our human form. And so because it's like abstract, because it can be abstract and requires like a level of faith and storytelling, if those storytelling of these abstract like forces aren't really being like taught, then those generations aren't going to be able to make those connections because they're far removed from the storytelling. So I think like honoring history and legacy and like people who paved the way, I think if that's not done properly, then people don't continue to investigate new ways to serve communities because they don't really know like the foundations behind service, the foundations behind like living within villages, living within communities, having ritual, having different roles.
Physically
so, like,
relying on each other
North
for
America
things.
is very individualistic. We're like very much so, like that's something that I think plays a role in the growing pain, because we're so like individualistic and it's all about like you and like it's all about you, like this whole like togetherness that like a lot of church communities operate on, especially Orthodox Christianity. It's really counterculture because you're thinking of it as like one body, and it's like, well, one body what? Like, I'm not a part of one body. I'm my own person, and this works for me.
Right.
So that's like very against like where Orthodox Christianity was birthed out of, you know?
Yeah, I agree. Excellent. Thank you, Sally. Were you going to touch on that, Sharif?
Yeah, I was just going to mention that even, we're talking about American culture and, the growing pains, but people forget, just putting on my history hat, is that even within Egypt itself, the Coptic Orthodox Church went through growing pains when they went from their initial, traditions and rituals that were set up by St. Mark, St. Anianus, and then with the Arab conquest, they had to go through a different adaptation. So it's not like this is unique. People forget that in the 7th century, the Coptic Church went through transition and to adapt into the culture and kind of try to attract that culture, they changed their language to Arabic. They changed some of their traditions and certain in order to embrace some of the new culture and some of the new people that were in the country. So, and the church actually stayed just as strong, and they kept the rituals, and they kept the sacraments, and they kept the teachings of St. Mark and St. Agnanas and the early apostles. So I think this is just another, now it's American culture, and we have to adapt and we have to embrace that culture in order to bring people, and that was the goal, was to bring people in the church, not say, no, we're here, you stay outside. Mm-hmm. So it's all part of, I just wanted to remind people that it's not a new thing at all.
Yes,
Excellent.
It's important to adapt to the society.
Yeah.
Like short time ago, we opened a church in Kuwait.
Yeah.
So in Kuwait, you can go and pray for the Nile of the river, or to the Nile River. But you can go and pray for the oil fields.
Yeah.
Instead.
Yeah. I think. Oh, sorry. I think you had a. Sean?
Well, I was going to say, I think there's a good balance in also realizing it's not just like, when you say connections, like people do connect differently, but I think we've had a really great growth that I've seen in my own life, where we're a lot more open to different styles and different ways of connecting, and it doesn't have to be within liturgy. It could just be, the way you think and talk to God. So it's just having that mindset, I think, helps have some individuality and individualism in there, and it's just not, the liturgy isn't going to hit it for everybody the same way. Obviously, it's not going to connect with everyone in the same way, but because the rituals are important, we're going to keep those, but then they could always have different services that we've already started having within our churches. We have prayer meetings. I know Bayonne Church started doing, St. Emmanuel started doing a prayer meeting every, I think it's suspended for the summer or for the winter, but they were starting to do prayer meetings, and people were really upset because they were saying, well, these are more like, different types of churches sing this way. We don't really sing this way. We don't usually have a piano and a guitar and things of that sort, but it's beautiful, and so many younger people were connecting. So just having supplemental services and some supplemental offerings and teaching people to explore things in their own ways, I think helps with that as well.
Yeah, that is definitely, the specific example that you're giving is definitely one of the areas of, I would say it's one of the places where that tension exists right now. And I think it's also one of those places where it's really important to go back to that principle of like what was believed everywhere by all, that principle of like what has always been part of Orthodox tradition, and making sure that we are sticking to that and not varying, because it is, again, because, and that's one thing I want to emphasize. I think I've just seen it in my own life so many times, because again, Protestant churches go through this as well. Like growing up, my Protestant church split 2 times in the brief time that I was there into different congregations because people had a different opinion about their preferences. It actually was all about music, both times. People wanted to use different kinds of music. It can be a really divisive issue. And I think it's also important just to be, when it comes to Orthodoxy, we're not driven by, like we talked about, our personal preferences or what makes us happy. That's not the central focus. And recognizing that the reason we have these, if you want to call them rituals or practices, the spiritual practices of the church, they exist for a reason, and they have, persisted through the millennia for a reason. Like there's a reason that we pray liturgy the way we do, and there's value to that, whether it's comfortable or we like it or not. And I think often, so anyways, that's all I'll say about that. I agree with you that, trying to make sure that every individual person does have an authentic experience of Christ is huge. That is absolutely important, like no doubt about it. And anything we can do to make sure that every person does have an authentic experience of Christ, we should do that. Did you want to? Yeah. No.
Yeah, so I just, because I know we're coming up on time, thank you first of all, but this was really, because I didn't get to hear this in Chicago. So this was really, I think, a very balanced approach to the topic. I wanted to make two main points. The first is that part of our challenge as we go through this, I think, is to look at the essentials and feel like those things are nice additions, or it's good to be there, but they're kind of there because we have to preserve them. So I think the only caution that I would make also, even when thinking of liturgy and ritual and liturgy, is we have to maintain it because it's always been there. And I think what it's really important for us to understand is that historically the church has always been Eucharistic, and that there's very interestingly something happening right now in the global church, in the Western global church, both in North America and in Europe and in Australia, is that many people who come from a Protestant leading background, more evangelical background,